Okay, let's jump right into this. You might think that healing a torn ligament or a broken bone is just a purely physical waiting game, right? Like it's a simple matter of time, rest, and tissue repair. But, well, clinical performance psychology reveals something entirely different. An athlete's toughest battle is almost never just physical. It's often surviving the intense psychological trauma that follows a severe injury. Welcome to this explainer on the invisible agony of sports injuries, where we're going to explore the hidden battleground of recovery. Have you ever suffered a major sports injury, had a totally successful surgery, and had doctors enthusiastically tell you your physical healing was perfectly on track, yet you felt completely miserable, lost, and broken inside? Former NFL player Nate Jackson really hit the nail on the head with this exact feeling. He said, "My shoulder heals very fast, but my mind is a mess. I sit around in my bedroom and have panic attacks." Man, that brilliantly illustrates the intense disconnect between a healing body and a completely shattered mindset. So let's start with section 1, the problem, losing who you are. When an athlete gets hurt, society tends to obsess over the physical mechanics. We talk about the torn ligaments, the complex surgical procedures, and the physical therapy timelines. But we completely ignore a devastating psychological trap called the identity tunnel. This is a psychological state where an athlete's entire self-worth, their motivation, and their social standing revolve exclusively around their sport. So think about it. When you suddenly strip that physical capability away, they don't just lose a spot on the roster. They lose who they are. They're literally trapped in this tunnel, and someone just turned the lights off. Now, have you ever noticed that right when an injured athlete needs their teammates the most, everyone just seems to slowly disappear? It's a harsh reality, but research shows a shocking trend. The support of coaches and teammates often completely dissipates as soon as the novelty of the injury wears off. The team, well, they're forced to move on to the next game, and the injured athlete is just left completely behind. Which brings us to section 2, the agitation, the roller coaster of isolation. This sudden social isolation, combined with that jarring loss of identity we just talked about, launches the athlete into an absolute emotional roller coaster. We usually assume that athletes feel depressed right after the injury, and then, slowly and steadily get happier as their bodies physically heal. But a fascinating clinical case series tracking elite Division I collegiate athletes through their long-term recoveries completely shatters that assumption. The data shows that mood doesn't just slowly improve. Actually, it fluctuates wildly from day to day, even months or a full year into rehabilitation. Across all 3 athletes in that Division I study, they were asked to rate their negative emotions. Now, you might expect depression to be the highest, right? But the number one emotion they rated at a maximum 10 out of 10 wasn't depression. It was intense frustration. 10 out of 10. Just an overwhelming daily sense of being blocked, trapped, and completely powerless. And this intense frustration and anger didn't just happen right after the surgery or in the first few weeks. The clinical data revealed that dangerously high levels of anger and frustration remained incredibly prominent even 44 weeks into recovery. That is nearly a full year of intense daily emotional friction that the athlete is just quietly carrying around. To make matters worse, as athletes finally get close to full physical recovery and returning to the field, a massive new psychological hurdle appears: the paralyzing fear of re-injury. Because their mood has been so unstable for so long, they begin to obsess over negative outcomes. They become absolutely terrified that their body will fail them again, preventing a return to their pre-injury form. And research shows if this mental side of recovery isn't treated, athletes often never return to their pre-injury skill level, no matter how perfectly their muscles have healed. Have you ever been handed a resistance band by a physical therapist and told to do like 500 clamshells with absolutely no idea how this tiny repetitive movement is going to help you run fast again? It's kind of funny, but it's incredibly true. Because not knowing the why behind an exercise is actually a massive trigger for rehab anxiety. It just fuels that feeling of being completely out of control. Let's move on to section 3, the solution, the psychological rehab. Look, if we want to fully heal an athlete, we can't just treat the knee or the shoulder. We have to rehabilitate their mind with the exact same rigor and clinical dedication that we use to rehabilitate their physical body. Clinical research has identified 3 proven strategies designed specifically to conquer the emotional roller coaster of an injury. Step 1, demystify the process. Step 2, deploy mental skills. And step 3, build a new reality. Let's break these down one by one to see how they actively combat that intense rehab anxiety. Okay, so let's look at the first strategy. Demystifying the process. Remember those 500 clamshells? Athletes often become incredibly frustrated because they simply don't understand the complex rehabilitation process. They miss the subtle physical gains that their doctors easily see, which leads them to falsely believe they've hit a dead-end plateau. To fix this, physical therapists absolutely must explain the specific anatomy of the injury, how progress is being gauged, and the exact purpose behind every single rehab exercise. Because when an athlete understands the why, their anxiety plummets and their motivation absolutely skyrockets. Step 2 is mental skills training. This strategy turns the athlete from a passive patient into an active participant. You don't have to just sit there and suffer through the frustration. Research proves that athletes can actively take back control of their recovery by treating their mental state like a daily workout. By utilizing specific sports psychology tools like positive self-talk, mental imagery, and structured goal setting, you can actively cope with that paralyzing fear of re-injury we highlighted earlier. Now, before we hit the final step, I want to pose a rather intense question to you. If you woke up tomorrow and could never play your sport again, who would you be? Really think about that for a second. If you don't have an answer, you are deeply trapped in that identity tunnel we talked about, and you need to start building a new reality today. And that brings us to our third and final step. Build a new reality and lean on your medical team. Because, as we saw earlier, teammates and coaches almost always fade away once the novelty of the injury wears off. Therefore, athletic trainers and physical therapists frequently become the athlete's primary source of emotional support. The clinical data says you need to lean on them. But even more importantly, you have got to use this unexpected downtime to step outside your identity tunnel. So, how do we actually build true resilience in the real world? Well, one athlete in the clinical study noted that a massive key to her coping was finding a positive environment entirely outside of competition. She actively explored her city and made a conscious point to surround herself with non-athletes. This allowed her to build a completely new reality, giving her powerful, non-athletic distractions from the injury. It expanded her identity so that her self-worth wasn't solely tied to her physical performance on a field. An injury can be devastating, for sure, but it absolutely doesn't have to break you. By treating your mind, leaning on your dedicated support systems, and finding your identity outside of the jersey, you can come back stronger than ever. Which brings me to a final provocative question to leave you with. What was the most frustrating part of your own injury recovery? Think about how the clinical data we explored today maps onto your personal lived experience. The physical healing is really only half the battle. Conquer the mind, and the body will follow. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.